October 12, 1944, 6:47 in the morning. A Japanese fighter climbed through the pale light over Formosa, its pilot searching the horizon for the American fleet. He had been told the warning had come. He had been told enemy aircraft were approaching, but the sky in front of him looked empty. That was the trap. The Americans were not in front of him, they were above him. A gray shape dropped out of the sun, fast and heavy, and the pilot had less than 1 second to understand what was happening before 650 caliber guns tore through his aircraft. His fuel tank burst, his wing folded, and the fighter fell in a burning line toward the sea. He was not the first Japanese pilot to die that morning. He was not close to the last. At airfields across Formosa, ground crews were still dragging fuel hoses away from aircraft when the first bombs landed. Pilots were still climbing into cockpits when their runways broke open beneath them. Commanders were still trying to turn a sighting report into a defense plan when the defense plan became meaningless. Japan had received 17 minutes of warning. 17 minutes. Not 17 minutes to win. Not 17 minutes to maneuver. 17 minutes to realize that the war in the Pacific had changed into something Japan no longer understood. Because the American force appearing off Formosa was not just 8 carriers. It was not just hundreds of aircraft. It was not even the Hellcat fighters ripping through the sky above the island. It was a system. And systems do not fight the way men expect them to fight. They arrive before you are ready. They know where you are before you know they are watching. They replace their losses before you can count yours. And by the time you finally see the whole machine, it has already passed over you. 3 days later, the numbers were written down in language cold enough to feel unreal. Japan's Second Air Fleet had gone into the Formosa battle with roughly 700 aircraft on paper. By the time the American carriers withdrew, fewer than 200 were still available. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in the air, on runways, inside dispersal areas, or beside fuel trucks that never had time to move. American losses were a fraction of that. The kill ratio did not look like a battle, it looked like an equation, and the equation said the same thing every way it was solved. Japan could still send men into the air. Japan could still order them to die. But Japan could no longer defend the Pacific from a fast carrier force that could appear beyond the horizon and turn an island air fleet into wreckage before breakfast. To understand how that happened, you have to stop looking only at the explosion in the sky. You have to look backward, not to one admiral, not to one aircraft, not to one heroic charge. You have to look at the small decisions that stacked together until they became unstoppable. A factory decision in Bethpage, New York. A shipyard decision at Newport News. A radar decision aboard an American carrier. A code-breaking decision in a basement at Pearl Harbor. And a command decision by men who realized the next naval war would not be won by the side with the prettiest aircraft. It would be won by the side that could find, launch, direct strike, repair, and repeat faster than the enemy could think. The Japanese Zero had been built for one kind of sky. It was light, it was graceful. It could turn inside almost anything the Americans sent against it in the first years of the war. Japanese pilots trusted it because in the hands of a veteran it felt almost alive. But that grace had a cost. The Zero was thin-skinned. Its fuel tanks did not protect their pilots the way American tanks did. Its structure saved weight by giving away forgiveness. It could dance, but it could not take punishment. The F-6F Hellcat was the opposite lesson. It was not elegant. It was big, blunt, and built around a massive Pratt and Whitney engine that looked almost too large for the aircraft behind it. Some men who saw the early design thought it was too heavy for carrier warfare. Too much airplane, too much engine, too much armor. They were asking the wrong question. The question was not which fighter could carve the tightest circle in a clean duel. The question was which fighter could climb fast enough to reach the fight first, dive hard enough to leave the fight alive, carry enough ammunition to finish the job and bring its pilot home after being hit. The Hellcat answered that question with steel. It carried armor. It carried self-sealing fuel tanks. It carried 6 heavy machine guns and enough ammunition to keep firing when lighter fighters had to break away. It did not need to outturn a Zero. It needed to refuse the kind of fight the Zero wanted. American pilots learned the rhythm. Do not circle with it. Do not admire it. Hit from altitude. Dive through. Climb back. Do it again. By 1944, that rhythm had become routine. Japanese pilots would see the Hellcats above them, and the geometry of the fight would already be over. But even the Hellcat was only one piece. A perfect fighter cannot change a war if it sits on the wrong deck. The Essex-class carriers changed the deck. Before the war, a fleet carrier was a long, expensive promise. Something that took years to design, build, test, crew, and send to sea. The United States turned that promise into a production problem. Shipyards broke huge carriers into sections. Those sections could be built at the same time. Machinery, compartments, bulkheads, wiring, armor, and deck structures moved through an industrial rhythm that made a carrier less like a handmade weapon and more like a rolling wave of steel. Japan could not match that. A Japanese carrier lost in 1942 was not simply a ship removed from the board. It was an experience base removed with it. Aircraft handlers, maintenance crews, trained pilots, command habits, deck procedures, fuel systems, the thousands of small things that make a carrier more than metal. When America lost aircraft, factories made more. When America lost pilots, training pipelines pushed more men forward. When America needed flight decks, more hulls came down the ways. That was the second machine behind Formosa. Not one carrier, not 8 carriers. A nation that had learned how to manufacture floating airfields faster than Japan could destroy them. And then came the third piece. The piece no pilot could see. Radar, radio, fighter direction, the invisible geometry of modern battle. By 1944, the American Fast Carrier Task Force was not simply launching aircraft and hoping brave men found the enemy. It was watching the air around itself. It was reading movement at distances where human eyes were useless. It was turning dots on a scope into orders in a pilot's headset. Climb to 20,000. Turn 10 degrees left. Enemy formation bearing 270. Intercept in 6 minutes. That sounds simple now. It was not simple then. It required trust. Pilots had to trust men sitting in dark rooms staring at screens. Squadron leaders had to accept that a radar plot could give them a better picture than their own eyes. Admirals had to concentrate authority in officers whose weapons were headphones, grease pencils, timing boards, and mathematics. Many resisted it. Of course they resisted it. Navies are built on experience, and experience teaches the last war with the confidence of a priest. But the Pacific in 1944 was no longer the war of 1942. By then, carrier combat had become too fast for eyesight and instinct alone. A strike force detected too late was not a threat. It was already overhead. A fighter patrol placed in the wrong sky was not protection. It was decoration. The Americans learned to put their fighters where the enemy was going to be, not where the enemy had already been. That single change turned minutes into kills. It turned radar contacts into ambushes. It turned 17 minutes of Japanese warning into an American lifetime. That was what Formosa revealed. Japanese commanders saw American aircraft arrive again and again with a precision that felt unnatural. Their fighters were intercepted while still climbing. Their strike groups were met far from the carriers. Their airfields were hit by waves that seemed to understand exactly which runways, fuel points, and maintenance areas mattered most. It was not magic. It was information moving faster than command confusion. And once the information reached the flight deck, the American carriers could act with terrifying speed. Deck crews pushed aircraft into launch position. Engines coughed, roared, and steadied. Signal flags snapped, propellers blurred. Hellcats rolled forward into the wind. Dive bombers followed. Torpedo aircraft lifted behind them. A carrier deck that looked chaotic from far away was, up close, a timed industrial process performed by men who knew that one mistake could throw a body into a propeller. This was not romance, it was labor. Grease on hands, salt in eyes, fuel fumes, exhaust heat. Sleepless officers making decisions from incomplete reports. Mechanics patching aircraft so the same machine could fly again before the day ended. That was the part Japan could not bomb quickly enough, because the real enemy was not just what America launched, it was how fast America reset. By noon on the first day of the Formosa strikes, Japanese air power on the island was already bleeding from wounds it could not close. Runways were cratered. Fuel burned. Aircraft that had survived the first strikes had no safe field to return to. Commanders faced the worst kind of decision. Launch damaged, tired, underprepared aircraft against a fleet that was already waiting, or leave them on the ground to be destroyed in place. They launched, and the system ate them in the air. A Japanese strike group climbing out toward the sea could believe for a few minutes that it still had surprise. Then the radios would crackle. Then dark specks appeared above them. Then the formation broke apart under gunfire before the carrier force ever came into sight. American fighter directors had done their work. The pilots were not hunting blind. They were being delivered to the enemy with altitude, speed, and angle already arranged. That is the difference between courage and architecture. Courage is a man flying into danger. Architecture is making sure he arrives above the danger before the danger knows he exists. Formosa burned because the Americans had both. But Formosa was not the final battle. It was the warning shot. 6 days later, the same system moved toward the Philippines, and Japan prepared the most desperate naval plan it had left. Operation Shugo, Victory Operation. The name sounded confident. The plan was anything but. Japan no longer had enough carrier aircraft to fight the American fast carriers directly. So the remaining Japanese carriers would be used as bait. Admiral Ozawa would bring them down from the north, almost empty of aircraft, hoping they looked valuable enough to pull Admiral Halsey away from Leyte Gulf. While Halsey chased the decoy, Japan's battleships and cruisers would push through the central Philippines and attack the American invasion fleet. The plan depended on timing. It depended on secrecy. It depended on the Americans seeing the wrong threat at exactly the wrong moment. And at the center of it stood two ships built for a world that carrier aviation had already begun to bury. Yamato, Musashi, 72,000 tons each, 18-inch guns. Armor thick enough to make older naval officers believe battleships still represented the final argument of war. On October 24, 1944, American search aircraft found Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea. She was enormous, too large to hide, too powerful to ignore, and too slow to escape what was coming. The first American aircraft came in through anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed to stitch the sky shut. Torpedo bombers dropped low. Dive bombers rolled from altitude. Fighters swept gun positions. One wave struck, then another. Then another. This was the American carrier doctrine at its most merciless. Not one dramatic attack, sustained pressure, find the target, hit it, withdraw, rearm, send another wave. Let the enemy damage control teams exhaust themselves. Let flooding become impossible to balance. Let fires spread faster than they can be contained. Let the ships survive the first blow, and the second and the third, until survival itself becomes the trap. Musashi took torpedoes and bombs for hours. Her crew fought flooding room by room. They counter-flooded, they pumped, they shored bulkheads. They kept engines turning even as the ship settled lower in the water. But physics has no patriotism. A warship can be brave only through the men inside it. Steel itself eventually answers to weight, water, and holes. By evening, the largest battleship the world had ever seen rolled over and disappeared beneath the Sibuyan Sea. The battleship age did not end in one explosion. It ended by arrhythmic, wave after wave, hit after hit, minute after minute. The same lesson Formosa had taught in the air, the Sibuyan Sea taught in steel. The system did not need one perfect strike. It needed enough good strikes, delivered relentlessly, by a force that could keep coming. And yet the story nearly turned, because after Musashi sank, Halsey saw Ozawa's carriers to the north. The bait had worked. The American fast carriers moved away. San Bernardino Strait was left exposed. In the darkness, the battered Japanese center force turned back. Yamato and the surviving heavy ships came through the strait. At dawn on October 25th, they found not Halsey's fleet carriers guarding the way to Leyte. They found Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Ships built to support landings, hunt submarines, and carry aircraft for close air support. Not to stand in front of Japanese battleships. Their carriers were smaller. Their aircraft were loaded with the wrong weapons. Their screen ships were thin-skinned compared to the cruisers and battleships now appearing over the horizon. On paper, Taffy 3 should not have survived long enough to become famous. But paper was not in command that morning. Men were. And the first decision that mattered came from Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer Johnston. He did not wait for a clean order. He turned toward the Japanese battle line, toward it. A destroyer charging battleships. The phrase sounds absurd until you understand what he was really doing. He was buying time. He was making smoke. He was forcing Japanese gunners to solve a moving problem under pressure. He was turning a small ship into a question large enough to slow a fleet. Other American ships followed with the same impossible logic. Destroyers laid smoke. Escort carriers turned into the wind and launched whatever they could. Pilots attacked with bombs that were too small, torpedoes meant for different targets, and when weapons were gone, empty runs designed to make Japanese officers duck, turn, hesitate, and misread. This was not a clean victory. It was confusion weaponized. It was the habit of coordination surviving after the perfect plan disappeared. The same culture of communication that allowed the fast carriers to function as a system now appeared in miniature off Samar. Small ships, outgunned and out-armored, behaved as if they were part of something larger, because they were. They were part of a navy that had spent years learning how to pass information, coordinate action, create pressure from multiple angles, and make the enemy's picture of the battle worse than its own. Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force, did not see a tidy diagram. He saw torpedo wakes, smoke, aircraft diving from different directions, shell splashes, radio confusion, reports that did not align. His formation had been hammered the day before. He did not know exactly where Halsey's carriers were. He did not know whether he was seeing a small escort group or the edge of a larger trap. So he made the decision that saved the Leyte invasion fleet. He turned away. That turn was one of the most consequential moments in naval history. Not because Taffy 3 destroyed the Japanese battle fleet by itself. It did not. Not because bravery replaced firepower. It never does for long. The turn mattered because a system had produced an illusion powerful enough to change an admiral's decision. A handful of smaller ships fought with such coordination, aggression, and pressure that the enemy could not afford to believe they were alone. That is what systems do when they work. They make the small look large. They make minutes feel like hours. They make incomplete force look complete. They make the enemy hesitate at the moment hesitation costs the war. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf ended, Japan's ability to conduct major naval operations had been broken. Its carrier force was effectively gone. Its surface fleet had been cut down. Its pilots could not be replaced fast enough. Its fuel situation was worsening. Its commanders could still plan, still order, still sacrifice, but the strategic instrument they needed had been destroyed. The decisive battle Japan had sought for decades had come. And when it came, the decisive weapons were not the ones pre-war doctrine had imagined. Not the biggest guns, not the most elegant fighters, not the most beautiful ships. The decisive weapon was the American ability to connect factories, carriers, aircraft, radar intelligence, training, command, repair, and doctrine into one moving organism. That organism had names behind it. Roy Grumman and the engineers who built a fighter around survivability instead of elegance. Shipyard workers who turned carrier construction into an industrial rhythm. Mark Mitcher, who understood that carrier power had to be concentrated, directed, and kept moving. John Thack and the fighter pilots who knew tactics had to change faster than pride. Code breakers and radio analysts at Pearl Harbor who turned fragments of enemy traffic into operational warning. Radar officers whose work was invisible unless it failed. Deck crews whose labor made every strike possible. And the men of Taffy 3, who proved that doctrine was not a binder on a shelf. Doctrine was what men did under fire after the original plan had collapsed. Most of them did not become household names. Some received medals, some received citations. Some went home to classrooms, offices, farms, radio stations, and quiet streets where nobody understood what they had seen. Some did not go home at all. The ships sailed back under different flags of memory. The technology became standard. The radar rooms became combat information centers. The fighter directors became the ancestors of modern naval air defense. The carrier task force became the model every navy had to study, and the lesson hardened into something uncomfortable. Every part of the system had been doubted before it was accepted. Heavy fighters were doubted. Carrier concentration was doubted. Radar direction was doubted. Signals intelligence inside operational planning was doubted. Prefabricated carrier construction was doubted. Not because the doubters were fools, because experience is powerful. And sometimes experience protects an organization from bad ideas, but sometimes it protects an organization from the future. The men who changed the Pacific War did not possess certainty. They possessed evidence, urgency, and the willingness to argue before the proof was socially safe. That is the part that disappears when history becomes clean. We remember the battle. We forget the meetings. We remember the explosion. We forget the drawing board. We remember the carrier deck full of aircraft. We forget the supply lines that put fuel in every tank and ammunition in every gun. We remember the admiral's order. We forget the radar operator who gave him enough time to give it. 17 minutes over Formosa was not only a Japanese failure, it was the visible edge of years of American preparation. Every Hellcat that dropped from altitude carried more than a pilot and 6 guns. It carried the argument that survivability mattered. Every Essex-class carrier-launching aircraft carried the argument that shipbuilding could be accelerated without losing purpose. Every radar vector carried the argument that information could become a weapon before the enemy even saw the fleet. Every attack wave over Musashi carried the argument that pressure, repeated with discipline, could kill what one blow could not. And every smoke screen off Samar carried the argument that a coordinated small force could force a larger one to doubt its own eyes. That is why October 1944 matters. It was not just a month of battles. It was the month the old assumptions ran out of room. Japan began that month still looking for a decisive naval battle. America arrived with the machinery that decided battles before they started. By the time the last smoke lifted from Formosa, by the time Musashi was under the sea, by the time Kurita had turned north and the Leyte beaches were still alive, the answer was already clear. The Pacific had not been won by one miracle weapon. It had been won by 1,000 connected decisions, made in basements, made in shipyards, made on flight decks, made in cramped radar rooms, made by men who understood that the next war is never defeated by worshipping the last one. 17 minutes was all Japan had over Formosa. For the Americans, those 17 minutes had taken years to build, and that is how wars are usually decided. Not at the moment the first shell falls, not when the loudest ship fires, not when the smoke makes the battle visible, but long before that, in the hidden work that makes the visible victory possible.